15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
The space race created history while breaking barriers by successfully landing 2 men on the moon and returning them safely to the Earth. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969 and Neil Armstrong took the first steps on the moon, the whole world celebrated. But to fully understand the significance of this event, we need to rewind a bit back to 1947, more than a decade before the space race started to unfold. In 1947, the United States and the Soviet Union were each racing towards technological and scientific achievements. Each country wanted to gain an advantage over the other using propaganda. The US also got to the point where they started recruiting German scientists to help with the process of developing rocket technology in an event called Operation Paperclip. At the end of World War II, scientific advances were being made that would eventually lead towards space expedition. The successes of Operation Paperclip would eventually pay off for the USA, but the Soviets certainly seemed to be a clear leader in this race at first. The United States and the Soviet Union both decided to launch satellites into space. However, the Soviet Union achieved the goal first.
Both countries officially announced plans to send satellites into orbit. Months later, while the U.S. was still working on a launch vehicle, the Soviet Union's Sputnik 1 propelled into orbit on October 4, 1957. A month after launching Sputnik 1, they launched Sputnik 2, carrying a dog named Laika. The U.S. was still behind and ashamed that the Soviet Union was so far ahead of them. About a month after Sputnik 2 was launched, the U.S. attempted at their version of an artificial satellite. It was a rocket called Vanguard that only got 4 feet into the air before it smashed into the ground. Immediately, it was known as Kaputnik or Flopnik.
In a split second.
After the U.S.'s first embarrassing failure, in January of 1958, the United States successfully launched their first satellite, Explorer 1. It orbited the Earth over 58,000 times and was back in slightly over 2 years. Then on July 29th of that same year, President Eisenhower founded NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, for uses of keeping up with the space program and to ensure that the U.S. caught up to the Soviet Union. In August of 1958, the U.S. launched the Pioneer O to reach the moon. This blew up before it could even get into space. Fail, and Pioneer 1, 2, and 3 were also failures.
On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy challenged the nation to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
This was a big ambition due to the fact that the Soviet Union already had a much more accomplished space program than the U.S. did, and had already sent the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space on April 12th of that same year. But on May 5th, 1961, the U.S. launched Alan Shepard into space in the Mercury 7. But the Soviet Union only seemed to increase its advantage by launching the first woman into space, Valentina Tereshkova, carrying out the first spacewalk, having the first spacecraft to impact the moon, as well as the first to orbit the moon. The United States was at a huge disadvantage. At first, NASA didn't have the proper tools and equipment and were clearly at a disadvantage in the race with the Soviets, but these disadvantages didn't stop them.
The U.S. was finally gaining when, in 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Progress continued steadily from there, but at times it was increasingly costly to try to break the barriers of space flight. Tragedy struck on January 27, 1967. During a pre-flight test for Apollo 1, Edward White, Virgil Grissom, and Roger Chaffee, the astronauts assigned to the Apollo 1 mission, were killed due to a command module fire. The fire was intense because of the high oxygen levels in the module and the difficulty of opening the escape hatch under such conditions. This incident made NASA realize that they could not rush the process too much if they wanted to avoid any more deaths. It also led NASA to require further testing, which ultimately made future missions safer. Besides the Apollo 1 accident, the others were good learning experiences, and each one got the U.S. a step closer to breaking the barrier of space, although it would take 9 more missions into space before a human actually set foot on the moon. Apollo 2 to 3 were unmanned suborbital flights, while the unmanned flights of Apollo 4 through 6 achieved Earth orbit. A major barrier would be broken with the launch of Apollo 7, which was the first manned launch in Earth orbit in this program, and Apollo 8, which reached and orbited the moon. Apollo 9 successfully tested command and lunar modules in space, and Apollo 10 returned to the moon and tested the LEM in moon orbit. Still, there was one last step, one great barrier still to break. That would be the job of the mission of the greatly admired Apollo 11.
It was July 16, 1969, 9:32 a.m., and 3 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, were launched into space in the Saturn V rocket with a 200,000-pound thrust. After much hard work and training, it was finally ready to be done. 500,000 people in Florida and 530 million people on Earth eagerly watched the rocket erupt into the sky and break through the limits of the atmosphere. Their goal? To get the first man on the moon. It was the well-awaited Apollo 11 mission.
Mission sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
During the process of getting the ship to the moon, the engine skirt separates from the launch escape tower. Halfway into their second trip around the Earth, Apollo 11's third stage engine boosts itself out of orbit. The module then gets separated from the adapter. It took approximately 102 hours, 45 minutes, and 40 seconds after the launch of the Apollo 11 crew to reach the moon in the shuttle. While on the exciting journey, the crew ate, slept, checked the ship's progress from the monitors, and showed the audiences back on Earth via television scenes of the Earth slowly diminishing from their view and their own activities inside the cabin.
The Saturn, the Columbia, the Eagle, and the little EMU.
On July 20th, Aldrin and Armstrong crawled out of the command module Columbia and into the lunar lander Eagle to start heading to the moon. Collins stayed in Columbia to orbit the moon. At 4:17 p.m. on July 20th, 1969, the Eagle, the lunar lander module, officially landed on the moon. After the Eagle secured base on the moon, Armstrong said,
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Twink. Thanks a lot. You're looking good here.
What?
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
6.5 hours after they landed, people from all over the world eagerly watched Armstrong finally step onto the surface of the moon. The impossible barrier beyond mankind's wildest dreams had been shattered. Aldrin later followed him 20 minutes after.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
During a fulfilling 2 hours of exploring, Armstrong and Aldrin set up a television camera, raised the majestic American flag, collected roughly 47 pounds of samples, talked with the President, Richard M. Nixon, prepared scientific equipment, and presented millions of listeners detailed information of their experiences.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spent a total of 21 hours and 36 minutes on the surface of the moon, and after a flight of about 195 hours, Apollo 11 landed in the Pacific Ocean on Thursday, July 24th, nearby the recovery ship USS Hornet. Navy members brought them into the USS Hornet, and the command module got carried away as well. After being greeted by President Richard Nixon, who was already on board the Hornet, the astronauts were kept in isolation for 16 days due to scientists' concern of the presence of pathogens coming from outer space. There was no bacteria found. Begun in the aftermath of World War II, the space race took many twists and turns, and many barriers, both technological and political, were broken. Motivated by the Cold War struggle, the race accomplished something that human beings of all backgrounds, religions, and countries could celebrate. Who would have guessed at the time, given its origin and intense international competition, that today we would be cooperating with the Russian Federation in space exploration as we jointly run the International Space Station. The space race, which broke many barriers in its day, is still capable of breaking barriers today. Cooperation for peaceful scientific advancement can be of benefit for all people everywhere.